Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. Our guest today is Rabbi Mathew Marko. He's the rabbi of Beit Israel in Greenville, South Carolina. Hello, Rabbi. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, Shmuel. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
You got a wonderful Parshat Lecha, the third Parsha of the Torah. In this Parsha, Abraham, whom we still call Avram, is summoned to the land of Canaan, walks to the land of Canaan. He then goes down to Egypt and then goes back and fights certain kings. And then there is a story about him and Hagar and Ishmael. It's a very eventful parsha, and it begins with the following pasuk: ויאמר אדוני אל אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדתך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך. So God tells him to go to the land that he will show Avram. So Rabbi, I'll begin. You called it in our previous conversation a softball. Who's Avram? Who's Avram? Why him?
Who is Avram? Well, first of all, the question, who is Avram, is we have to ask the question, is Avram a mamash, actual person who lived and taught, or is Avram an idea for something larger, a metaphor? I don't know, maybe both, I think. But if we put it in historical perspective, we have to remind ourselves that in this time, in ancient days, people worshiped idols, and each town had a different god. There were many gods. Each force of nature had its own god, and people thought that they were jealous and petty and pretty dangerous beings. So you brought sacrifices to appease the gods, because if the gods were happy with you, then you could expect things like rain in your fields and children and prosperity. But if the gods were upset, well, then watch out. And then at some point in ancient Israel, a small group of people began to imagine different ideas about the divine and humanity and our relationship with one another. And they dared to imagine a God who wasn't in stone or wasn't in wood, but a God who was everywhere, who lovingly created and cared for the universe. And this isn't a jealous God that we're supposed to worship out of fear, but one out of love, and that we are commanded, we're expected to act in a just way towards one another. What God says to Avram, v'yeh bracha, and it's so often translated as, and you will be a blessing, but it's not. It's tzivoy. It's a command. Be a blessing.
Right.
So, really, this was nothing short of a spiritual revolution. And of course, the fancy term of it is ethical monotheism, but that's what started it all right there. So Avram V'Sarai, whether we look at them as mamash people or as the personification of this tribe, these progenitors of monotheism, the three great Abrahamic faiths, it doesn't really matter. It's talking about something larger and a radical revolution in how we see ourselves in the universe and how we see the Holy One.
So if we look at him as a symbol of something, what is the meaning of him having to move from another country to this country? Why can't we start with a symbol who resides somewhere and begins a new faith or a new system value or a new, inquires into the mysteries of the universe? Why does he need to move?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Is it necessarily a physical move, or is it a spiritual move? And again, there's so many different layers in Torah, which is why it's Torah. The fact is, if you look at it from a point of view of where people were and what they were doing and how they looked at it, God is saying to them, you've got to leave this behind. You've got to be willing, and all of us have to be willing at some point to put aside what we think we know, because we think we're so smart. We think we have all the answers, when the fact of the matter is we don't even know what we don't know. And Avram was strong and courageous enough and faithful enough to leave behind what he thought he knew. And what does God say? He says, I'm going to bring you to a land that I will show you. It doesn't even say a whole lot about it. Yet Avram says, oh, I'm hearing something. I'm feeling something. I know what I've been doing is not working. I know that God is not in a statue. And I know that God is the loving creator and caretaker of the universe. And if this is calling me and saying, I've got to go someplace else to learn something deeper and learn something more meaningful, he says, yeah, I'll go.
And one of the things that we see in this parsha, um, and maybe that's the essence of who Avram is this constant restlessness within him. He moves back and forth, and he fights, and he relaxes, and he struggles. There's no dull moment in this parsha, and especially if you compare Avram to his future son, to Isaac, who's always relaxed, stays in one place. With Avram, you never know what's the next move.
And I mean, you'll find the same with his grandson as well. And not to discount Yitzchak, because he's also our father. But when you look at Avram and Yaakov, I think that's the essence of who we are as a people. This notion of wrestling and questioning and willing to move. And we make mistakes because, I mean, if you look at the beginning of the Parsha, what does God tell him? He tells him to go to Canaan, but he overshoots. He winds up there. He winds up down in time. He's not told. Right. He's not supposed to go there. And yes, he's definitely struggling. It reminds me. I think he's struggling with a dual nature of God. I mean, there's certainly more than two, but I think we all, in many ways, look at there's. I was telling you before we began. There's a midrash that I've been particularly interested in that I've been looking at this week, and the midrash talks about a man who's traveling, like Avram Avinu, and he's traveling from place to place, and he comes across some a bira achad doleket, a palace doleket, and I'm going to leave doleket untranslated for a minute.
Okay.
And so he sees this bira doleket, this palace something, and he asks, is it possible that this palace doesn't have a caretaker? How could this be? Well, as soon as he says that, the owner pops his head out the window. He says, no, I'm the owner. I'm here. And the midrash goes on to say that Avram, our father, says, is it possible that the world itself lacks a caretaker? And it's at that point that the Holy One calls out to him and says, Avram, I'm God. I'm the sovereign of the universe. So this bira, I said, is a palace, but doleket, like many words, can mean a couple of different things. Number one, like lahadlik, we say lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, shel Chanukah. It means illuminated, bright, illuminated. So the meaning of the midrash in this story is we have this man who's traveling from place to place, and he sees this beautiful palace, and it's glowing, and it's illuminated with life, and he says, wow, who made this? Who owns this place? In other words, Avram, in his travels, he looks at the world, and he sees the mountains, and he sees the sky, and he sees the sunset, and he sees the grandeur and the order and the majesty that's our world, and he thinks to himself, this doesn't happen by accident. Somebody had to have made this. Somebody had to have created this out of love and intelligence and awe. Now, on the other hand, though, the leket also can mean burning or in flames.
Right. Yeah.
So in this case, who's Abraham? He's looking out at the world and he says, wow, what's going on here?
It's going up in flames.
It's going up in flames, right? And we can look around today and say the same thing. It's somehow, regardless of this, God is present, and that burning palace does indeed have an owner. And even though sometimes it feels like you're right, the world is burning to the ground, that faith to know that there's a divine presence, there's a benevolent, loving God, gives us the notion that we can go on, we can keep moving, and then whole part of this covenantal relationship that Avram and God have, and it's personified, I think, in the Brit Ben Batarim, the split animals. is that there's a dual nature to a covenant. A covenant is a partnership. And that means there's dual responsibility and dual privileges. So who's going to fix this world? Who's going to fix this palace? Well, it's not just the owner of it, it's us as well. We're brought in. And that is how Avraham Avinu and the Holy One began this relationship that we are the beneficiaries. We inherited this wonderful covenant, this wonderful relationship with an owner of a palace. And do we see the world as in its glory and its grandeur and its beauty and see God in it? Yes. Do we see the world also as a place that's engulfed in flames and desperately in need of our help? Yes. And it's both of those things.
And when we look at Avram himself, would you say we can see him as a likable person? You know, he's obsessive, he's restless, he's inquisitory. He doesn't, you know, rather than just enjoy the sunset and the sunrise, he keeps asking questions. So maybe he's not that likable.
Likeable, you know, I will say this, and you know, maybe chas v'shalom, some people would disagree with me. He was far from perfect. Now, before I became a rabbi, I was a carpenter and I made fine furniture. And if you looked in my house, you saw very, very little fine furniture. And it's that adage of the cobbler's children never have shoes, because you're so, you know, when you have your responsibilities, you look to all that, and sometimes you neglect the people that are closest to you. And Avram, for all of the good that he did and all of the revolution, and him as a spiritual leader, I think sometimes he wasn't the best family man. I think he neglected the things that were close to home.
And we begin to see it in our Parsha.
We begin to see it for sure. And it's something I have to remind myself. I mean, in my position, I do usually have a day off in theory, but it doesn't always happen. You know, somebody gets sick, or God forbid someone dies. And I know it's a strain on my family life, and it's a strain on my wife. So yeah, I mean, Avram, I think he's likable. I think he has some amazing insights, but I think part of what makes him likable, and part of what makes him amazing, is what makes all of our biblical heroes amazing. Unlike other traditions, you know, in Christianity, this is a perfect exemplar, a perfect human being. Even in Buddhism, the Siddhartha Gautama, he achieves perfection and enlightenment, yet he chooses to stay on earth to guide other people. Whereas our heroes are highly flawed. Yaakov, he starts out as a punk, and he cheats his brother, and he has to flee. And all throughout his life, he has these struggles, and Abraham as well. And I think the reason why they're such compelling figures is because they struggle with a lot of the things that we struggle with, because human nature really hasn't changed that much. Times change, words change, but our problems, our hopes, our dreams, and our fears are the same. And what we see are our heroes, we see them struggle with these things, and we see them go through arcs, and we see them wrestling. And what an example for us to try to live up to in our lives as we wrestle with the things that are important and the things that are not so important.
Rabbi, this was illuminating. Thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
That was it? Wow, that was too much fun. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.